All right. After a fabulous start this morning for this program and lots of reinforcement, I have the great pleasure now to introduce you to a great friend of the Hellenic Association for Behavior Analysis, Κοινότητας, Ανάλυσης, Συμπεριφοράς, Dr. Neil Martin. Dr. Martin received his doctorate from the University of Kent in the UK. University of Reading in the UK, and then was a postdoc, a teacher at Kent. And then started a lifelong adventure in the dissemination of behavior analysis. Neil and I and our colleague Stowe Laboratory Analysis Συμπεριφοράς share two very important characteristics. One is that we just love radical behaviorism, not just applied behavior analysis, but the philosophy of science of behavior analysis and its implications in every aspect of our lives. And we feel so lucky to have learned this approach to understanding life in general, that we have made a big point in our lives of disseminating the good news to other individuals. Myself, principally here in Greece, Neil in the whole world, because since 2015 he has been the Director of International Development of the Behavior Analysis Certification Board, which is the manner in which behavior analysts are certified in English-speaking countries at this moment. At first, his job was to go around the world and introduce people to how we can be qualified, how we can make sure that somebody that calls themselves a behavior analyst is in condition to provide the services that in Distihon commensurate with a natural science of behavior. And because of some legal issues which we have discussed among the members of the community before, the Behavior Analyst Certification Board was required, for reasons having to do with the law, to limit their certification to countries in which they themselves could analyze the material in the same language and so forth. So his role in the Behavior Analysis Certification Board has changed now. The BACB did not leave us unprotected and unsupported. Neil's job has changed now to travel around the world and could not only help to establish training programs, which he has done in many countries around the world, but also to help each country to develop their own certification system in their own language, so that in each country we can protect people from the harm that might be caused by thinking they're getting a behavior analyst that has all of these skills and doesn't have these skills, and to support everybody in engaging in this kind of activity. He has taught, many of you know him from our previous conferences, he has been a wonderful supporter of the Hellenic Association for Behavior Analysis, and I'm very, very pleased to have him with us today to give a talk called The Professionalization of Applied Behavior Analysis Around the World. I give you world traveler, radical behaviorist, and dissemination expert, Neil Martin.
Efarastopouli, Robert. What a fantastic introduction. Kalispera. I think Robert's already given half of my talk. Yes, my role, I work for the BACB, but I am the only employee, firstly, not based in the United States. I'm from the UK and I'm based in the UK. And secondly, not actually contributing to the BACB in terms of income generation. The BACB actually pay me to go out and help other countries, which was one of the things that we announced when we announced that we were no longer going to offer certification. But unfortunately, it was the last thing we announced, not the first thing we announced. And in retrospect, after reading the first two, I think people were so annoyed with us that they didn't bother reading the third one, which is that we would actually continue to help and support countries. And that's what I'm here to talk to you about, what's happening around the world, some case studies, and then some barriers to that work. But I want to start off by talking about two specific countries in terms of case histories. And the first is the United States. And I'm going to limit my kind of historical case study to the growth of applied behavior analysis rather than behavior analysis or behaviorism. And in the United States, the start of applied behavior analysis, I guess, really starts with the publication of the Journal of Applied Behavior Analysis in 1968 and has moved through to what's currently happening, which is a licensure across many of the states. But to provide some historic context to this, as early as 1972, there were discussions in the US about the importance of having certification or licensure, but what they really meant was having some kind of protections in place for the consumers of behavior analytics services. And in the 1970s, those were largely adults with developmental disabilities rather than children or children with autism. In 1974, at a conference looking at these issues further, the majority of the program in 1974 actually focused on the regulation of the profession. In 1975, Minnesota created its own certification program, and jobs and job placements in Minnesota were on the basis of completion of an exam, a multiple choice exam, and assessed job performance during some kind of probationary period. Now, I realise that's probably too small and so old that it's difficult to read. But if we look at this hierarchy, on the left-hand side, back in the 1970s, they describe the job responsibilities for a technician, then a senior technician, then a specialist, then a senior specialist, then a behaviour analyst 1, 2, and 3. And so these were ongoing discussions that were taking place nearly 50 years ago now. In 1970, well, the late 1970s, Florida also developed a certificate program as distinct from the certification program that it later developed. And that came out of the Florida Development Services Program Office. They offered workshops as a means to gain a certificate. And they had a 2-day written exam. Now, for those of you that may have taken the BACB exam or any university exam, a 2-day exam sounds like, you know, hell on earth. They also involved open-ended questions, which are notoriously difficult to score and very subjective. You were required to be 90% correct, but there were no specific eligibility requirements. Anyone who wanted to take this 2-day exam was able to do that. There was also a period where you were observed post-exam, and perhaps not surprisingly, they only issued a few dozen certificates. I don't think many people know about this, but the Association for Behaviour Analysis International, that was previously the Association for Behaviour Analysis, and before that the Midwestern Association for Behaviour Analysis, actually tried to start certification. Those discussions started in 1978. It was approved to move forward by the Executive Council in 1979. And they moved forward with a two-stage process. The first stage involved some general assessments. The second stage involved some more subjective assessment. And due to legal concerns related to legal liability and the subjectivity of assessing people via assessment rather than psychometrically designed examination, they were advised by legal representation to stop doing that in 1987. And then shortly after that, in 1983, Florida developed a certification program. And this is the program that eventually became, well, was eventually taken over by the BACB. Again, there were no eligibility requirements. One completed workshops or self-study. And then the content was provided by the state in terms of a state behavior programming manual. And if you will, this was task list 1. And this still exists, but it exists in ring-bound folders on a couple of people's shelves. And it's so kind of lengthy and verbose that unfortunately, it doesn't lend itself to copying into a single document. They had 95 multiple-choice questions and 53 free response items, but they were eventually eliminated because of the subjectivity of that. And the eligibility requirements at the time were a bachelor's degree and 1 course in behavior analysis. And that was the certified behavior analyst, and they also had a certified associate behavior analyst. And in 1998, that was all revised and produced a second edition task list. And actually, that was the exam I took in 2002. Over 15 years, Florida certified quite a few people, 2,000 or thereabouts. And then it started to import the certification program to other states. So Oklahoma was the first to use it. And then between 94 and 98, it was also used in California, Texas, Pennsylvania, and New York. And by this time, it became very apparent to the behavior analysts and academics in the US that given the interest, that a national certification program was what was really needed. And that led to the BACB starting in 1998 and taking over the Florida certification program. So it amalgamated all of those existing programs, and its purpose really was to provide evidence that those who had this credential had met some minimal requirements in terms of training and experience. But as I stress, it was originally intended just to be a national US certification program. Just gives you a flavor of how this has evolved over the last couple of decades. So the one on the left is the second edition task list, which is the exam I took. And then the 3rd, 4th, 5th, and 6th. The 6th hasn't even come into operation yet. But this has to, out of necessity, be reviewed every certain number of years in order to ensure that the content is current, contemporary, and so on, so that when the BACB or indeed any organisation offers some kind of qualification, that it ensures that it reflects current practice rather than what happened 20, 30, 40, 50 years ago. Now, just to give you an idea of just how exponential this growth has been in the US, and I don't have the data going all the way back to 1999, which is when the first examinations were administered, but in 2013, there were more than 11,000 BCBAs and nearly 2,000 BCABAs with a total of 13,420. Now, at this time, I wasn't working for the BACB, but I was on the BACB board as the international director. And I remember celebrating when we had 10,000 certificants. But look at 2023. There are nearly 58,000 BCBAs in the United States. And with the introduction of the technician credential, the RBT, there are now, or at least there were when I put these slides together, 206,000 certificates that we have to worry about in the US. That figure is now closer to 240,000 because, again, the rise is just crazily exponential. In fact, every year the BACB has a discussion and it says, that was a crazy year. We can't possibly have as many people applying and taking the exam as the previous year. and every year that has exceeded. In fact, in the last 4 years, the BACB has certified more than half of the US practitioners, just in the last 4 years, even though it's been going for 24 years. And this shows you that there is a huge, actually the demand for jobs based on the BCBA certification pretty much matches the number of BACBs being produced. But what this shows is fairly unprecedented in that this is a new field, right? This is only in the last couple of decades. And already there's this not only an exponential growth, but a job demand for these individuals. So there is a market for this in the US. And this is another massive contributing factor to growth in the US, and that is the number of states shown in white that have licensure. So there are a number of MOs available in the US for the growth of the field that don't currently exist in other countries. Okay, let's move on to the UK, where I am from. Another interesting history. Our history of meetings where not only we presented, I say we, I was born in 1963, I wasn't actually at these meetings, but this predates the publication of the journal Applied Behaviour Analysis. And I like to make that point because I remember being at a conference in the US and hearing people having a conversation and saying, oh, it's really interesting what they're doing in Europe. They're really quite sophisticated, aren't they? And I tap them on the shoulder and say, well, you do realise that we've been around and doing this for 50 years, 60 years. And they didn't, but they do now. So the first experimental analysis of behaviour group met in 1963. And that was a mixture of presentations on experimental, basic and applied behaviour analysis. And then what flows from that is another history, or more history, which I'll take you through. So that conference that took place in 1963 is still occurring every 2 years. It's a much-loved conference. It doesn't have a huge attendance, but actually I like that because you get to meet everyone, hang out with everyone, have a drink with everyone, argue, debate with everyone in a way that's really not possible at a conference with thousands of people. But in the 1980s, what really spurred growth in applied behaviour analysis was this team, which emanated from the University of Kent, the Special Development Team. And this team was created in order to address issues related to government policy of deinstitutionalisation. And what that meant was that individuals who had previously been locked up in secure hospital settings because they had a developmental disability and problem behaviour were required to be rehoused within the community. And that wasn't an easy thing to do because for individuals who've been in hospital for 20, 30, 40 years and engaged in long-standing intransigent problem behaviour, they needed to have interventions designed for them. They needed to be able to contribute to the community. They needed to be able to find jobs and live with other people and so on. And it was the purpose of the Special Development Team to facilitate that. So the Special Development Team piloted the use of experimental functional analysis in the UK, assessed the function of problem behaviour, designed interventions, and then helped house people in the community. And the point at which I became involved was shortly after that, in 1990, where my role within a psychology department, but as a behaviour analyst, was to assess the problem behaviour of adults and help integrate them back into the community. Pardon? You said in Kent, Tizard? Yes, Tizard Centre, which is the University of Kent. In fact, the third day of my job, and I, by the way, I had no specific introduction or training to behaviour analysis or applied behaviour analysis during my first degree. But the third day of my job, the clinical psychologist who was my supervisor and who had explained to me that even though he was a clinical psychologist, he really identified as an applied behaviour analyst, He gave me a copy of Brian Iwata's 1987 paper toward a functional analysis of self-injurious behavior. And he said, read this. And I said, okay, why? And he said, because tomorrow we're going to do this. And I read it, and I had questions, and I emailed Brian Iwata, not expecting to get a response. And not only did I get a response, and a very quick response, but I was sent papers, including unpublished manuscripts, answering my questions, which was fantastic. And when I finally met Brian Iwata a year later at a conference, he saw my name badge and then shouted across the room, "You're that guy from the UK that's been emailing me. Come here and say hello," which is really lovely. So I've kind of felt integrated into the community. In 2001, a group of us who had found out and heard about BACB certification decided to create a BACB course sequence in the UK just because we could and just because we wanted to. It had no value. It wouldn't have meant anything to have the credential in the UK. But we identified as behaviour analysts, not as anything else, and so we wanted to do it. So we created a course that was hosted at Anglia Polytechnic University. And we ended up teaching 3 cohorts, that some of those individuals went on to create the first master's programs that were outside of the US. And in fact, one of my friends and colleagues, Oliver Mudford, moved back to New Zealand, where he was from, and created the first master's program in behaviour analysis outside of the US. So we were kind of early pioneers for this. In 2008, in the UK, we felt the time was right to have the profession recognised and ultimately, or eventually, regulated. And we applied to an organisation in the UK called the Health Professions Council. It was a very lengthy application, and they turned us down. Not because they didn't want us to be recognised and regulated, but because they said that there was currently a moratorium on accepting new applications from new professions. But we continued to pursue that. In 2014, the UK created its first national association. We actually decided to call it the UK Society for Behaviour Analysis. And that was formed explicitly to pursue the goal of recognition and regulation. And in 2020, we applied to a new organisation, well, not new, another organisation, the Professional Standards Authority, to publish a register of UK behaviour analysts. And the Professional Standards Authority publish the registers of clinical psychologists, organisational psychologists, speech and language therapists, occupational therapists, about 30 different healthcare professions. So if and when they agreed to publish the register, then by default, behaviour analysts would be a recognised profession in the UK. That process took 3 years. The Professional Standards Authority had to put the application into the public domain for comment. And the comments, and they said they had more comments about the recognition of behaviour analysts than any other profession. Most of them, like 90% of them, were absolutely, you must do this, this is really important. 10% or thereabouts were largely from the neurodiverse community, who said, if you let these people become officially recognised, you will be unleashing hell and damnation, and these people are the spawn of the devil, and all they do is abuse children with autism. And that was a problem. So there was a back and forth exchange where the PSA asked, how do you comment on this? And then there was commentary, and then there was more criticism and more commentary. 3 years later, January this year, the PSA finally decided to publish the register. So now we are officially recognised and self-regulating in the UK. Finally, which is great. And then also in January this year, the UK launched its own certification. So the higher level one is the UK Behaviour Analyst Certified, or UK BA Cert. and I am currently working with the UK in developing an examination for that credential. And the current situation in the UK, which is not a large country geographically, although we do have 68 million people or thereabouts, there are 5 university master's programs in behaviour analysis in the UK. As I say, the profession's been added to the list of healthcare professions. It has its own credentials. And every day there are jobs advertised in the UK looking for behaviour analysts to work within the National Health Service, offering positive behaviour support, to work with children with autism, children with developmental disabilities, adults with developmental disabilities. So things are looking good in the UK, even though it has taken a long, long time. But what's happening elsewhere in the world? Last year, actually this time last year, I was in Australia, which was a real joy because it's summer in Australia at this time of year, but winter in the UK. And I was happy to escape the cold, wet, grey London weather. In Australia, the Australian Association, the Association for Behaviour Analysis Australia, are pursuing self-regulation of the profession through an organisation that doesn't have a great acronym, the National Alliance of Self-Regulating Health Professions. And this is a model that's been used by other health professions in Australia, such as speech and language therapy, occupational therapy. So this is a valid pathway. So that's what they're doing. They have also developed their own credentials. And even though Australia still has access to BACB certification, they will transition over to their own credential, as will the UK, at some point. So things are good in Australia. Brazil has 2 long-standing behavioural associations. I can't remember exactly what the acronym stands for, but one is something like the Brazilian Association for Behavioural and Cognitive Sciences, and the other is Behaviour Analysis Brazil. They share similar membership. They're not huge organisations in terms of numbers. They're largely comprised of, how can I put this politely, crusty old academics who aren't really that interested in applied behaviour analysis. But because of the growing number of people in Brazil offering applied behaviour analytic services, there is a movement towards creating a practitioner association and having credentials in Brazil. And hopefully in a few months there'll be a conference designed to pursue that further. In China, and I was telling Robert a little bit about this yesterday, the China Disabled Persons Federation is an NGO that nominally exists to serve the needs of anyone and everyone in China with a disability. And conservatively, that's somewhere between 80 and 100 million people. So this is not an insignificant number and not an insignificant organisation. Historically, there have been 2 organisations nested below the China Disabled Persons Federation: the China Association for the Rehabilitation of Disabled Persons, and another one with a very similar name, the China Association for Persons with Psychiatric Disabilities and Their Relatives. Horrible names, but that's the way it translates. They have both had behaviour analysis courses, and they both have or had national associations. One was the China Association and one was the East China Association. Neither organisation has been willing to work with the other, and that's always unhelpful in a country that has multiple organisations largely trying to do the same thing. But a couple of years ago, so during the pandemic, a few of us who wanted to help, and that was me and 2 other Chinese-American behaviour analysts, suggested and met with the group of behaviour analysts in China and got them to agree that it would be more helpful to work together and to create this new organisation called the China Credentialing Committee for Applied Behaviour Analysis. Now, that now exists. They have met about 12 times. We haven't been able to get there to meet because of the pandemic and lockdown and restrictions although that is now possible. I'm hoping to go there next year and find out exactly where they have got to in terms of the progression. But this is wonderful because this is going to have such huge reach within China, just because of the link to the China Disabled Persons Federation. In Croatia, they are in the process of establishing postgraduate training in applied behaviour analysis, probably a master's programme at Osijek University in the east of Croatia. They are in the process of mapping the curriculum against the Croatian qualifications framework. There's a new Croatian association has been formed and is in the process of going through the formal process of being notarized and documented, and that association will work with the university to deliver that program. This has all largely been about politics, so I've had to create relations with the faculty, with the Chancellor, Vice-Chancellor, and the, what do they call, the Council for the Rehabilitation and Special Education, in order to make this possible. And it can take time, but hopefully next year something will move forward. The Czech Republic, interestingly, has licensure for behaviour analysts. Now, how the hell they were able to do this is something of a mystery, given that at the time there was only one person eligible for this licence. But it seemed that what happened is that someone wrote an amendment to a bill for licensing healthcare professions, submitted it, whoever read it didn't read it, or didn't read it very thoroughly, and just said, yeah, that's fine, and stamped it, and all of a sudden behaviour analysts were licensed in the Czech Republic. There's a master's programme at Masaryk University, and big plug for the European Association. Next year's conference will be at Masaryk University in Brno. And it's a fantastic conference, and I thoroughly recommend you attend if you can. There are also some fabulous wine bars and beer places within walking distance. Soon after the BACB announced it was no longer going to offer certification, a group of French behaviour analysts contacted me and said, well, you said you could help, what can we do? And I said, well, let's start by creating a national association. So they did. Like immediately, called OMPAC. And then I said, well, you need to integrate university training. So they did. There was a course at Lille and another one. And then I said, well, if you want to pursue this, you should design your own credentials. And they did. Develop your own ethics code, which they did. And in June last year, they had their first exams. And they are now up and running with their own credential, their own national association. So things are good in France. In India, I have been going to India on and off for a long time. The first time I went to India was in 1983, but not for work purposes. But in the last 15 years or so, I go to India nearly every year. And from the very beginning, I was having discussions about the importance of starting university training. And in India, the culture is that people in authority say yes, and the reality is they mean no, or at least they don't mean yes. But irrespective of the fact that there are no university, irrespective of the fact there are no university programs in India, somehow behaviour analyst was added to the list of healthcare professions by the Indian Parliament in 2020. So now they are officially recognised, even though there are no pathways to train as a behaviour analyst in India. Now, I'm working on that. I have a meeting next week with the India Institute for Psychology Research attached to the University of Bangor. And I have the Association for Behaviour Analysis India lined up to teach that programme. So we just have to put them together and have them say yes and mean yes, which is always a challenge. During the pandemic, fairly early on in the pandemic, I was contacted by 8 or 9 behaviour analysts in Indonesia who also said, can you help us? And I said, do you have any university training? They said no. And I said, well, that's what you need to do. You need to start some university training. A month later, they invited me to a meeting with the University of Indonesia. I made the case for why it would be good to start some training. They said yes, and apparently meant yes, because 3 months after that, they said, we are going to start a master's program in behavior analysis. They invited me to the launch, which is 3 months after that, so this all happened very quickly. What they actually said to me was, it will be really good if you could be at the launch, via Zoom, and say a few words of encouragement. And I thought, I can do that, even though it's 7:30 in the morning, UK time. So I appear at 7:30 expecting to say, this is fantastic, go, go, go. And they say, well, and thank you for Neil Martin. We're going to hand over to Neil Martin now. You have an hour to speak. So I did. So I just waffled for an hour. But I think I said good, interesting, professional things. But since then, there is now an Indonesian association for practitioners called IPAPI. They offer credentials, an SAP, which is a behavior analyst supervisor, which really means someone who can work independently and can supervise others. And I was there a month ago to launch, not launch the program, but to give certificates to the first cohort who had finished the program and have discussions with the university about turning it into a proper master's program, a degree-giving program, and also meeting with the Minister of Education, who was a very young, dynamic individual who said, I'll help you, just tell me what you need me to do. You want money? I can give you money. You want access to an online platform? I can give you that. So things are really interesting and happening very, very quickly in Indonesia. Plus the food was fantastic. Israel had two behavior analytic associations, the Israeli Association for Behavior Analysis and the Israeli Association for Certified Behavior Analysts. Like in China, they'd never worked together, couldn't even be in the same room together, or if they could, they would shout at one another. Due to a lot of political manoeuvring, we've now got them to agree that that's unhelpful. There's a new organization created, tentatively called the Israeli Organization for Behavior Analysis. And I've had discussions with them about helping them develop certification and an exam and so on. But because of what's happening in Israel at the moment, we've been unable to pursue that, obviously. After Indonesia, I went to Malaysia for a week or so. There's now a Malaysian Association for Behavior Analysis, which was a Malaysian Association for Certified Behavior Analysts. They have their own standards for practice and training. A master's degree was just started at Somewhere University in Kuala Lumpur, which I was there to say something and launch. And the Malaysian Association will deliver that program. In Poland, there are two small associations that are now working together, and they will offer a license. But when I say small, I mean organizations of 50 or so people. How am I doing for time? Okay, good. Romania is a country very close to my heart, mainly because I'm married to a Romanian. And so it has to be, but also because I started a course there and was teaching there from 2011. I was there every month for 3 years. I know Romania very well. I've travelled all over. Every time colleagues come, I take them and show them, Transylvania and all those kinds of places. The Romanian Institute for Behaviour Analysis has been trying to be recognised as a separate group for years, with a lot of opposition from the psychologists in particular. But now the Romanian College of Psychologists has agreed to have them exist as a kind of subspecialty of psychology. Now, I don't know how I feel about that, but nevertheless, it's a foot in the door and a way into them being recognised as a professional group. I'm not going to say much about this because Robert is going to say a few words about this afterwards, but just, for those of you that don't know, there has been a project underway to look at standards for training across Europe and to try and unify what's happening in terms of the educational qualifications, frameworks and so on. And they seem to map very well with one another. But what needs to happen next, I think, is that countries need to start adopting this within universities. But I'll let Robert say more about that later. Okay, let's talk about some of the challenges and barriers to this work, that not just the dissemination work, but the establishment of the profession, which is really what I've been trying to do. It's really difficult trying to start university training because most countries won't have any behaviour analysts, or they're certainly not within university system as faculty. So trying to make the case for why a university should start postgraduate training in behaviour analysis when none of their faculty will be able to teach it is quite complicated. Now, I have a rationale for that, which I provide and which I present. But you can imagine the university's reaction when you say, we really want you to start a course, but by the way, none of you can teach it because none of you are qualified or trained to do that. There's also, finding justification to start a course when actually there's a very small number of behaviour analysts or people who purport to be behaviour analysts in the country. But actually there's always, in more or less every country, there has been a market for these courses. And in many countries, there's just a general lack of awareness about what behaviour analysis is, and that old problem of, applied behaviour analysis, that's just this thing for children with autism. So that's problematic. But one of the largest barriers, I think, is the lack of access to translated resources. Now, there are some textbooks that have been translated, some textbooks that have been written. But, for the vast majority around the world, their access to resources, both in terms of textbooks and journals, is largely English, and that's kind of the way it is. And there are also difficulties in getting and having authors from outside the US publish in some of the predominant behaviour analytic journals which are published in the US. Now, one of the barriers is translation. So some colleagues and I at the BACB decided it would be really helpful if we could come up with a definitive list of behaviour analytic terms that then we could hand over to national associations and say, if you want to translate resources, start by agreeing on and translating these terms. So what we did is we took behaviour analytic terms from a variety of different sources, including these textbooks and other sources, and I just made a long list of them in an Excel spreadsheet. And there were something like 3,200 and something, so a lot. And then, I'm a kind of bit of a programmer as well, so I sorted the list, and I wrote macro to remove all the redundancies, and then we looked at the list to see if there were multiple phrases or terms for more or less the same thing, and we took those out. And we categorized them, so we blocked them into groups, concepts and principles, measurement, experimental design, and applied behavior analysis. We sent those lists out to subject matter experts across the world, not just in the US, and we said, what do you think of these lists? Is there anything missing? Is there anything that you think shouldn't be on the list? And we had very carefully removed generic terms. So everything on the list was, we thought, very specifically behavior analytic in nature. And after multiple reviews and iterations, we ended up with 587 terms, behavior analytic terms, both from applied and experimental behavior analysis. And so far, I've had them translated into these languages as a starting point for the translation of things like textbooks and journals. Colleagues and I also published a paper outlining some of the process involved in translating terms. So this was based on translation of terms into Spanish, and we produced if you like, a flowchart for considerations for translating terms, and it goes like this. You start with an English term, and then and if multiple terms exist for more or less the same thing, then you remove those to minimize redundancy. Then, if possible, you select a lexemic equivalent as a term to translate, to use. If that's not possible, a non-lexemic equivalent. If that's not possible, a phrase, or, paraphrase. If that's not possible, you could resort to an integrated Anglicism. For example, in Spanish, well, I guess in any language, because Skinner's use of terms like tact and manned are they're neologisms. They're not, they're terms that didn't exist before. In Spanish, they just resorted to adding an O, so they became tacto, mando. And if that's not possible, use a non-integrated Anglicism. And then a few years after that, I was involved in a project where we were translating terms into Russian. And how this started is because there were a group of people who were translating or intending to translate BACB exams, and there was another group who were translating the Cooper, Heron and Hewitt book in Applied Behaviour Analysis. And I wanted the two groups to work together, and they wouldn't. So Bill Hewitt and I went out and we met with one of the teams that were translating the Cooper, Heron and Hewitt book, and they just blew our minds with how academic and rigorous they were in terms of attention to detail. So, for example, when they were presenting on this, they'd say to Bill Hewitt, on page 387 of your book, you use the term auto-shaping. And Bill said, yeah. And they said, well, you reference Skinner, and if you go back and read Skinner, Skinner references Pavlov, and if you go back and read Pavlov, not the English translation, the original Russian, what Pavlov meant was, and therefore you should use this word, and we should use, and that's, you can't argue with that. So then we published a paper about some of the processes involved and some of the considerations in addition to the Spanish ones. And they were these. The first was, if it exists, preserve any kind of historical succession associated with the terms. So look at the origin. Does the word come, from Pavlov or before that, Thorndike, and so on? Preserve interdisciplinary compatibility, if you can. So look at overlaps with other established fields. Did you know, for example, that the stimulus equivalence terms, equivalence, transitivity, symmetry, and reflexivity actually come from Cantor's set theory in 1874? And then, if appropriate, maintain the uniqueness of a term. And then I gave the examples of things like manned and tact. We also did a review of Jabba articles to see how many non-US authors published, and the answer was not so many. The first graph shows that only 6% of authors, and this was between, I think, 2000 and 2015, were non-US. Only 9% of articles were from non-US institutions. That's the middle graph. And not many new authors were publishing. It was the same people publishing again and again and again. Okay, here's another challenge and barrier, and I mentioned this earlier, the fact that so many people around the world just think that what we do as applied behaviour analysts is provide intervention for children with autism. And it remains true that the majority of behaviour analysts, or at least the majority of certificates around the world, do work with children with autism. It's about 2/3. But we do work in a variety of different areas, many of us, and it's important to acknowledge that. And my God, there are so many pressing issues for behaviour analysts to attend to at this precise moment in time, and very quickly, I should point out. Things like climate change is not going to wait for very long. It's also very difficult to be taken seriously in the absence of being officially recognised and regulated. So I don't get invited to sit round the table and discuss guidelines and treatments for particular populations, and the argument being, well, your field isn't officially recognised. And my argument is, well, until you officially recognise it, how will you know what we can offer? Or, why shouldn't I sit round the table and offer advice on that? And as I'm sure many of you are aware, over the last, 2, 3, 4 years, there's been much anti-ABA rhetoric, largely centred on working with individuals with autism, where claims are made about ABA is just abuse and extreme use of punishment contingencies and so on. And whilst I'm absolutely sure that some of that stuff has happened from very bad practitioners, that doesn't necessarily mean that we should stop what we're doing or that ABA should not be recognised, because I have met doctors, lawyers, psychologists who haven't behaved very professional, unethically, but we don't even think about closing those down as professions. And my advice to individuals who want to argue on a point-by-point basis is don't do that. Just focus on messaging what we do, why we do it, and why it's important, not you're wrong because, and this is, you see what I mean? Because that's often highly reinforcing to the people that make these kind of criticisms in the first place. Okay, so this is, I suppose, the model and guideline for the kind of work I do. So behaviour analytic service provision needs to be regulated. It needs to be regulated because, consumer protection primarily, but, many of us work with very, very vulnerable populations, and the nature of our work is so important that it really needs to be regulated. But you can't have regulation until you have professional recognition. And so many of the countries I work with, it's about getting professional recognition. But you can't have recognition until you have agreed national standards. And there are a number of countries that can't even agree between them what those standards should be. Because agreement requires consensus, and not just from the behaviour analytic community, but from all major stakeholders. So don't underestimate, for example, the power of parents. The reason there's licensure in the US, or at least the reason there's reimbursement through medical health insurance in the US, is because of parents. It's not because of behaviour analysts. It's very self-serving, isn't it, for me to go to a meeting and say, you should recognise us. It's far more effective for parents and others to say, you should recognise them. And let me tell you why. And all of this requires professional infrastructure, including, probably most importantly, the availability of university training. So here's just a list of some of the things I do. I flippantly put peacekeeping at the end because I've often found myself in a position where I'm speaking to a group who won't necessarily or can't agree with one another. It becomes quite heated, and I sometimes metaphorically, sometimes not metaphorically, bang my fist on the table and say, sit down, calm down, you first, let's discuss this in a civilized manner. So the world needs more behaviour analysts, and that's truer now than it's ever been. I mean, it's always been true, but my God, do we need them, and we need them now and quickly. And we need them everywhere. We need them in government, we need them in all large organisations, shops, schools, universities. Individual countries need to develop their own infrastructure in order to support the training experience requirements and for the profession to emerge. And that requires recognition and regulation at national level, as I've explained, and the BACB is helping to do that, not just through my work, but also through funding and a whole host of other sponsorship initiatives and other ways we can help and support. So I'm so happy to be back here speaking to you all. Thank you for inviting me, and thank you very much indeed.